Ma'am, you will comply with my orders. Patch me through to NORAD, Lieutenant. Now. 2 F-22 Raptors. Missiles armed. A quiet physics teacher in the pilot's seat of a dying airliner, 50 lives behind her, and 10 seconds to prove she wasn't a terrorist. For 12 years, Wren Calloway was invisible. A woman who graded quizzes, brought snacks to faculty meetings, and never once looked up when jets crossed the sky above her small Vermont town. Nobody knew she used to be Viper, one of the deadliest fighter pilots America ever trained. Until the cockpit crew collapsed. Until the autopilot pushed her plane into restricted airspace. Until the only way to save everyone on board was to become the woman she'd buried 12 years ago, and reopen a secret someone had killed to keep closed. What she uncovers next will destroy a defense empire, expose a betrayal that shattered her closest friendship, and bring back someone she thought she lost forever.
Wren Calloway did not look up when the fighter jets crossed the sky above Thornfield. Not anymore. She used to. Years ago. Back when the sound of a jet engine still made her chest tighten like a fist closing around her heart. Back when she'd stop mid-sentence, mid-lecture, mid-life, and freeze, because that sound used to mean something. It used to mean her. Now it meant nothing. Now it was just noise. A contrail scratched across a blue Vermont sky while she carried a stack of ungraded physics quizzes to her Subaru, and she didn't even flinch. That was the whole point of Thornfield. That was the whole point of the last 12 years. She had built a life here, the way you build a shelter after a storm. Quiet, small, load-bearing walls made of routine. Wake at 5:45. Coffee, black, 2 sugars, because sugar was the one indulgence she allowed herself. Drive the same road past the same white church, with the same crooked steeple. Teach 4 sections of physics to teenagers who thought Newton's third law was something you could ignore if you tried hard enough. Go home. Grade papers. Sleep, repeat. No one in Thornfield knew that 12 years ago Wren Calloway did not carry a grade book. She carried a call sign. Viper. 5 confirmed kills. Dozens of strike missions that never made it into any newspaper, because they were never supposed to exist in the first place. She had been one of the best. Not one of the best women. Not one of the best for her age. One of the best, period. Full stop, no qualifier needed, and then June died. Except, Wren stopped herself right there, the way she always did. Right at the edge of that thought. Like a pilot pulling out of a dive a half-second before the ground. She did not think about June. Not before coffee. Not ever, if she could help it. Which was, of course, a lie she told herself every single day and believed a little less each time. The house on Larkspur Lane had come with the job. Small. 2 bedrooms. One she used and one she filled with boxes she never unpacked, because unpacking them meant deciding what to do with a leather flight jacket that still smelled faintly of jet fuel and a photograph of 2 women standing in front of an F-15E with their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like the whole sky belonged to them. She kept that box under the bed, face down, because some mornings were harder than others, and on the hard mornings she did not trust herself not to open it. This was not a hard morning. This was, by every outward measure, an ordinary Tuesday, and Wren had learned the hard way that ordinary Tuesdays were the ones you had to watch the closest. Disaster rarely announced itself with fanfare. It preferred to walk in, wearing the same clothes as every other day, quiet, patient, until it wasn't. She stood at her kitchen counter in a gray cardigan and a pair of reading glasses she didn't strictly need but wore anyway, because thick frames softened the shape of her face into something forgettable. Forgettable had been the goal for 12 years. Forgettable was safe. Her conference bag sat by the door, packed the night before, with a folder of notes on projectile motion and torque, because the Vermont Secondary Educators and Symposium had asked her, for the 3rd year running, to give a talk on making physics relevant to 16-year-olds who mostly wanted to talk about prom. She had said yes, because saying no required an explanation, and explanations were the one thing Wren Calloway could not afford to give. The coffee maker gurgled its final complaint. She poured, added 2 sugars, and caught her own reflection in the window. Above the sink-dark hair pulled back tight, a face that had learned, over 12 years, to arrange itself into pleasant and unremarkable, and eyes that hadn't quite mastered the trick. Her eyes still looked like a pilot's eyes, sharp at the edges, always scanning. She'd never been able to fix that. She'd stopped trying. "You're doing the thing again," said Marnie Ostrander, leaning over the fence with a coffee of her own. Marnie had lived next door for 6 years and knew exactly 2 things about Wren Calloway: that she taught physics and that she hated small talk before 8 in the morning. "What thing?" "The thing where you leave for a boring conference and somehow look like you're heading to a funeral." Wren almost smiled, almost. "It's a physics symposium, Marnie, in Burlington. I promise you it will be exactly as thrilling as it sounds." "Uh-huh." Marnie sipped her coffee. "You need a ride to the airfield?" "I've got it." "You always got it." Marnie said it like an accusation, like she'd noticed something and filed it away for later. "One day you're gonna need someone, Wren Calloway, and I hope I'm standing close enough to catch you." Wren didn't answer that. She got in her car, because some things you don't answer, you just drive away from them. The road out of Thornfield ran past the elementary school, past Iverson's Hardware, past the crooked white steeple that had watched over this town since before anyone currently living in it had been born. Wren drove it on autopilot, the way she drove everything now, competently, unremarkably, with no part of her attention left over for the version of herself that used to fly at 400 knots 80 feet off hostile terrain, and call it a Tuesday. She caught herself thinking, as she often did on this stretch of road, about the last real conversation she'd had with June Alcott. Not the mission briefing, not the radio chatter in the final minutes. The conversation before all of that 3 days before, in a mess hall that smelled like burnt coffee and diesel, June leaning back in her chair with that reckless half-grin she always wore like armor. "You ever think about what happens after, Vipe?" June had asked. "Like after all this, when we're too old to strap into a jet and somebody finally makes us hang it up?" "I don't think that far ahead," Wren had said. "That's your problem." June had pointed her fork at her, entirely serious under the grin. "You live entirely inside the next 40 minutes. One day the next 40 minutes are gonna run out, and you're gonna need to know what comes after." Wren gripped the steering wheel a little tighter now, 12 years later, in a Subaru instead of a cockpit. She still didn't know what came after. She'd just gotten very good at not asking. The charter terminal at Thornfield Regional was barely a terminal at all. One counter. One overworked gate agent named Denny, who'd worked there longer than Wren had lived in town. A parking lot half full of pickup trucks belonging to teachers and school administrators, all of them boarding the same small charter Skyline Air 217, a leased Boeing 737-800, contracted out for the statewide education conference circuit. 41 educators, 6 district administrators, 1 pilot with 30 years in the seat and a co-pilot barely 5 years out of training, and Wren, seat 14C, Azel. She always took the aisle. "Miss Calloway," a voice cut through the small crowd of gray-suited educators, shuffling toward the gate Principal Delacroix from the middle school, waving her over with the enthusiasm of a man who'd clearly had too much coffee. "You're presenting this year, right? The projectile motion thing? My nephew's in your 3rd period. He says it's the only class he doesn't sleep through." "High praise," Wren said dryly. "I'll try to live up to it." "You always do." Delacroix fell into step beside her toward the jet bridge. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, where'd you even do your training? Physics degree, I mean. Your resume was thin on that when the district hired you. Not that I'm complaining. Best hire we ever made." Something old and careful tightened behind Wren's ribs. "Around," she said, with a practiced ease that had taken years to perfect. "Here and there. Nowhere interesting it was. Technically, not a lie. The United States Air Force Academy, followed by advanced systems and tactics training at 3 separate classified installations, was, by most military standards, extremely interesting." Wren had simply learned, over 12 years, exactly how much truth a sentence could hold before it became dangerous. Delacroix, mercifully, let it go. already distracted by the boarding announcement. Crackling over the terminal speakers, Wren settled into 14C with her paperback, the one about tectonic plates that she'd been meaning to finish since spring break, and did what she always did on planes. She counted exits. 4. She noted the pitch of the engine spooling up, cataloging the whine and shift and settle the way another woman might catalog the sound of her own children breathing in the next room. Old habits. They never really leave. They just go quiet. 3 rows up, a young woman in pale blue scrubs was folding herself into a window seat, headphones already in, eyes already closed. Wren noticed her only because of the small gold pendant at her throat, a compass rose, worn soft with age, clearly not new. The kind of thing you inherit, the kind of thing someone presses into your palm and says, "Hold on to this, it was your mother's." Wren looked away, because it wasn't her business. Because a compass pendant on a stranger's neck was just a compass pendant, nothing more. She had no idea, not yet, not for hours still. The young woman's name, printed on a boarding pass she'd tucked into a battered paperback of her own, was Delia Alcott. It meant nothing to Wren. Not yet. Takeoff was clean. The Boeing lifted off, the short Thornfield runway, at 8:52 a.m., banking gently west over a landscape of red and gold maple canopy that looked, from 3,000 feet, like something spilled and beautiful. Wren watched it fall away beneath the wing with the detached appreciation of someone who had once seen far more dramatic things from far greater heights and had trained herself, over a decade, to find this smaller, gentler version of altitude enough. It usually was enough. The climb was clean too. The plane leveled at 35,000 feet somewhere over the White Mountains, cutting a steady line west toward Burlington, and for nearly 40 minutes, nothing happened. Nothing happened. The way nothing happens right before everything happens. Wren used the time the way she always did, reading. Half listening to the murmured conversation of 2 district administrators in the row behind her, debating budget line items with the low, exhausted intensity of people who'd had this exact argument at least a dozen times before. Ivy Sutter, the young flight attendant, working the aisle, offered coffee with the automatic cheerfulness of someone who'd clearly done this exact walk 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. "Coffee, ma'am, please." Wren accepted the small plastic cup, added nothing to it, and went back to her book. Ordinary. All of it. Ordinary. That was the thing about disaster. It rarely bothered announcing itself. It preferred to arrive wearing the same clothes as every other day. She felt it before she understood it. A change in the cabin pressure so small it should have been nothing. A pop in her ears that any other passenger would blame on altitude and forget within seconds. But Wren's body had been trained by a machine that punished hesitation, and some circuits never fully power down, no matter how many years of grading papers you try to bury them under. She looked up from her book. Because something was wrong. She just didn't have a name for it yet. 2 rows ahead, near the forward galley, Ivy was knocking on the lavatory door. Softly at first, then not softly. Sir, are you okay in there?" No answer. Ivy knocked again, harder. Her knuckles were turning white. Wren set her book down. Didn't close it. Just set it down, spine bent, on her lap. Waiting. Cataloging. That old, dormant part of her brain, quietly assembling data before her conscious mind had even finished asking the question. First Officer Grant Ellery had gone into that lavatory 18 minutes ago. Wren remembered, now that she thought about it, the slightly gray cast to his face when he'd passed her row on his way forward. She'd clocked it and dismissed it. Turbulent sickness, maybe. A bad breakfast, nothing that concerned her. She wished later that she'd trusted that first instinct more. Then the plane jerked. Not turbulence. Wren knew turbulence. Turbulence has a rhythm, a bounce, a give and take, like a boat riding a swell. This wasn't that. This was a hard, uncoordinated yaw, the nose swinging left like something had shoved it. And then, the drop. The seatbelt light didn't chime first. The plane pitched down first, and the chime came a half-second later, like it was apologizing for being late. Screaming, instant. A laptop went weightless somewhere behind her and cracked against the overhead bin. A coffee cup hit the ceiling. Somewhere near the back, a child began to wail, high and thin and terrified. Wren did not scream. She unbuckled her seatbelt, because 12 years of dormant instinct doesn't ask permission. It just moves. "Ma'am, sit down." The man in 14B grabbed for her wrist, panic white, and Wren peeled his fingers off her arm, with a gentleness that surprised even her. "Let go," that was 2 words, not unkind, just final. She pulled herself hand over hand up the tilted aisle, bracing against the negative G that wanted to lift her off her feet entirely, past rows of terrified passengers, clutching armrests and each other, past Principal Delacroix, white-knuckled and praying, past the young nurse in pale blue scrubs whose eyes had snapped open wide, with a fear that had nothing yet to do, with the compass pendant swinging wildly from her throat. Wren reached the galley, where Ivy was pounding on the cockpit door now, both fists screaming a name that wasn't answering. "Captain Hastings, Captain Hastings, please." "What happened?" Wren's voice came out flat, steady, a voice built for chaos. "I don't. The first officer went into the bathroom 20 minutes ago, and never came back, and now the captain isn't answering the intercom, and the door is locked, and I don't have the code. I don't have fire axe." Wren was already moving toward the galley wall, where Ivy pointed with a shaking hand. Glass shattered under the heel of Wren's palm. She didn't think about the cut it left across her knuckles. She grabbed the axe, turned to the keypad beside the cockpit door, and her fingers found a 6-digit sequence that should have faded from her memory years ago. It hadn't, because some knowledge doesn't fade. It waits. The light blinked green. The door clicked. Wren shoved it open. Captain Roland Hastings was slumped forward over the yoke, 61 years old, 30 years flying commercial. His face had gone the color of wet ash, lips tinted faint blue, and the dead weight of his body was driving the control column forward and left, forcing the aircraft into a spiral it had no business being in. The master caution panel screamed red. A mechanical voice, calm in a way that felt obscene given the circumstances, chanted on a loop, "Bank angle, pull up, terrain, help me move him." Wren didn't wait for Ivy to agree. She was already hauling at the captain's shoulder, unlatching his harness with fingers that remembered exactly how a harness worked, even though it had been over a decade since she'd needed to know. Together they dragged Hastings back, out of the seat, down onto the narrow floor of the cockpit. His breath was shallow, thready, alive, but barely, and barely wasn't a word Wren had time to sit with. She dropped into the captain's seat. For 1 full second, her hands hovered above the yoke and did not move. Because the last time she held a control stick this tight, a fireball had bloomed against a desert sky, and a voice she loved had gone silent over the radio forever. "Don't. Not now." The altimeter was unwinding. Fast. Too fast. 35,000 feet, falling toward 14, and the airspeed needle was creeping toward a red line that meant the wings would simply stop being wings if she let it get there. Viper took the yoke, not gently, not gradually. All at once, the way a light switches on in a dark room, and Wren Calloway ceased to exist for exactly as long as the emergency required. "Hold on to something," she told Ivy, and her voice had changed. Lower, sharper, a voice built for cockpits, not classrooms. She fed in rudder. Steady, punishing pressure. Not a yank. A yank at this speed would tear the airframe apart, and she felt the aircraft answered her the way a heavy, wounded animal answers a hand it doesn't quite trust yet. 10,000 feet, 8.6, the nose came up. At 4,000 feet, above the gray churn of clouds, and whatever lay beneath them, skyline 217 leveled out, and Wren exhaled a breath she didn't remember holding. Her hands, trembling faintly against the yoke's leather grip, adrenaline finally arriving late to a party it should have started an hour ago. She had no time to feel it, because the navigation display in front of her was wrong. She stared at it, then stared harder, because it didn't just look wrong, it looked impossible. The autopilot, before it disengaged, had been carrying them steadily off the filed flight plan east, not west, drifting hard toward a stretch of restricted military airspace that had no earthly reason appearing on a civilian charter's course correction. Wren's stomach dropped lower than the altimeter had, because she recognized this, not the airspace, the pattern. A gradual drift, a silent divergence, invisible until it wasn't. Autopilot logic, quietly compounding a tiny error into a massive one. The kind of failure that doesn't announce itself with alarms until it's already too late to unhappen. She had seen this exact signature before, once, 12 years ago, in a cockpit that wasn't a Boeing, over territory that wasn't American soil, in the final minutes before June Alcott's F-15 stopped answering the radio forever. No. Wren shook her head once, hard, like she could physically knock the thought loose. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Systems fail. Systems fail all the time for 100 boring reasons that have nothing to do with ghosts. Except the pattern was identical. The exact cadence of drift. The exact false confidence readout right before divergence. Which meant either she was losing her mind at 35,000 feet with 50 lives in her hands. Or she wasn't. She didn't get to finish that thought. Unidentified aircraft, squawking 7700. The radio cracked to life, harsh and immediate, filling the cockpit with a voice trained for exactly this moment and no other. This is the United States Air Force. You have entered restricted airspace. Divert immediately to heading 290. Acknowledge or you will be intercepted and subject to lethal force. Wren's eyes cut to the window, gray, fast, predatory. An F-22 Raptor broke through the cloud deck off her left wing, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet turn toward her, deliberate, assessing. A second Raptor slid in on her right, boxed in. Underneath the left Raptor's wing, the weapons bay doors sat open, exposed, an AIM-9X Sidewinder catching the gray daylight. Not a bluff. Ivy check on the captain. He's breathing. Ivy stammered from the floor, her voice fracturing on every third word. Barely. Ma'am, are they going to— Not if I can help it. Wren keyed the radio. Her hand did not shake. That surprised her more than anything else that morning. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian charter Skyline 217. Captain and first officer are medically incapacitated. I have assumed manual control of the aircraft. Attempting to comply with heading 290. Silence on the other end. A long one. Because somewhere in a windowless command room, someone was staring at a screen that told them a Boeing 737 that should have been in the ocean by now was instead flying level. And the voice on the radio belonged to a woman who claimed to be a passenger. Flight 217, this is Raptor lead. Young, disciplined, suspicious in the specific way only fighter pilots learn to be. Identify yourself. Are you a certified commercial pilot? Wren looked out at the jet sitting on her wingtip, at the squadron insignia catching the light on its tail. Raptor lead, this is Wren Calloway. I am a passenger. I do not hold a current commercial license. The silence that followed was worse than the first one. Flight 217. The voice hardened. We are running your name through the FAA database. We have no record of a Wren Calloway holding any certifications. You are commanding a heavy aircraft in a restricted, high-security zone. If this is a hostile takeover, you have 10 seconds to turn this aircraft around before I put a missile through your left engine. 10 seconds. Wren felt something old and cold settle into her chest. Not fear. Fear would have been easier. This was calculation. This was the exact stillness that had kept her alive over hostile skies a lifetime ago. And she hated how easily it came back, like a coat she'd sworn she'd given away that turned out to still fit perfectly. 50 people behind her. A dying man on the cockpit floor. A young woman with a mother's compass pendant somewhere in the cabin, holding her breath like everyone else. If blowing her cover was the price, she'd pay it. Raptor lead. Her voice dropped, flattened, slid into a cadence that hadn't left her mouth in 12 years, but apparently had never left her body. Check the FAA database all you want. You're looking in the wrong system. Patch me through to NORAD, Lieutenant. Ma'am, you will comply with patch me through. Cold. Absolute. Tell them authentication code Tango Bravo 907 is currently flying this aircraft. Tell them Viper has the stick. And tell them to get me a vector to a medical runway before my captain dies on this deck. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind with weight. Through the cockpit glass, Wren watched the Raptor pilot's helmet tilt, just slightly, the universal posture of a man talking urgently to someone he cannot afford to disappoint. 30 seconds passed. It felt longer than the fall from 35,000 feet had. Wren used those 30 seconds the only way she knew how: scanning instruments, monitoring the captain's shallow, uneven breathing behind her, calculating fuel, remaining against distance to the nearest usable runway, because panic was a luxury reserved for people with nothing left to do. She still had plenty left to do. When the radio clicked back on, the voice wasn't young anymore. Flight 217, this is NORAD actual. We are verifying authentication. Stand by. Wren held the yoke steady, level, straight. Behind her, faintly, she could hear Ivy praying under her breath, the words tumbling together into something that wasn't quite English anymore. Just sound, just need. Authentication confirmed. A pause longer than protocol required, and then quieter, almost human. Holy hell, it's really you. Wren's jaw tightened, because she knew that voice. Not from 12 years ago exactly, from before that. From a training squadron on a base that didn't exist on civilian maps, where she had once stood behind a green, terrified 23-year-old, and told him, in no uncertain terms, that if he flew a diamond formation that loose one more time, she would ground him herself. Tobias, she said. Just that. Major Tobias Kern, came the reply, and she could hear the disbelief bleeding through even the strict military cadence. Ma'am Wren, we thought you were completely off the grid. We thought... I was teaching high school physics, Tobias. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Are your boys going to shoot me down, or are you going to give me a runway? A sound on the other end. Half a laugh, half something closer to grief. Copy that, Viper. Hearing your voice on that stick is the best news I've had in a decade. A pause. We're vectoring you to Ashwell Field. Emergency and medical crews are already spinning up. Descend to 10,000 when ready. Copy Ashwell Field. The Raptor on her left wing dipped, almost a bow, and a new voice cut in younger, chastened, all the earlier suspicions scrubbed clean out of it. Ma'am? Captain Silas Whitmore. It's an honor to fly on your wing. Wren almost smiled, almost. Save it, Captain. Compliments won't keep this bird in the air. Her eyes swept the instrument panel, cataloging damage with the same cold efficiency she'd once used to catalog enemy positions. Tuck in under my belly. I need eyes on the fuselage. That dive pulled some ugly numbers, and I want to know what I'm working with before we're on final. Copy that, Viper. 12 years. Gone just like that in the space of a single radio call. She hadn't planned to say the name again. Ever. And now 2 fighter jets and an entire command bunker were calling her by it like she'd never put it down at all. She thought, briefly and viciously, of every parent-teacher conference she'd sat through since moving to Thornfield. Every faculty potluck, every version of herself she'd carefully constructed, brick by brick, specifically so this exact moment would never happen. It had happened anyway. Some things, apparently, could not be outrun. Only postponed. They descended through cloud in tense gray silence, the Raptors flanking her like an honor guard she hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to lose. Behind her, on the cockpit floor, Ivy was performing chest compressions on Captain Hastings with the kind of desperate rhythm that comes from refusing to accept an alternative. He's fading, she gasped between pushes. Miss Calloway's pulses. Keep pushing. Wren didn't look back. Couldn't. Don't stop until wheels are on the ground and paramedics take him from you. Do you understand me? Yes. Yes, ma'am. A yellow caution light flared across the overhead panel, then a horn, sharp and insistent. Hydraulics, Flight 217. Whitmore's voice again, urgent now. You've got a fluid leak, right main gear bay. Looks like the lines ruptured in your recovery maneuver. Wren's jaw set. Because of course they had. Because nothing about today was going to be simple. And some small, exhausted part of her almost laughed at the audacity of it. Almost. She flipped the alternate gear extension switch and prayed, actually prayed, silently, to whatever might be listening 3,500 feet above the Washington coastline that the backup system would hold. A violent clunk shuddered through the airframe. Gear doors forced open. 2 green lights bloomed on the console. The third stayed dark. Whitmore. Talk to me. A beat. Then grim. Your right main's jammed halfway out. Looks like it's hung up on a fractured strut. Ma'am, if you put her down like that, that gear's going to collapse on impact. Your wing's going to hit pavement at speed. Wren closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Long enough to feel the full weight of it, not long enough to let it stop her. Copy, she said. I have to land it exactly as it is. Viper, that was Kern's voice now, breaking through, and for a moment, the 23-year-old she'd once trained bled through the Major's composure. You're talking about balancing a 160-ton aircraft on one leg at 140 knots. If that wing drops too soon, then I guess, Wren said, I better not let it drop. She keyed the cabin intercom next, and when her voice reached the passengers, it had transformed again, steady, warm, almost gentle, the voice of a woman who had spent a decade calming frightened teenagers through pop quizzes and fire drills. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Wren again. We are on final approach. We have a mechanical issue with our landing gear. I need everyone in the brace position now. Heads down, hands over your heads, and stay there until I tell you otherwise. She paused, just half a second, and added something that wasn't in any emergency procedures manual. I've done harder landings than this one. I need you to trust me for the next 4 minutes. That's all. 4 minutes. 3 rows back, Delia Alcott pressed her forehead to her knees, one hand closed tight around the small gold compass pendant at her throat, murmuring something that might have been a prayer and might have been a name. She had no idea the voice steadying 50 strangers belonged to the one person alive who could have told her exactly whose pendant that used to be. Not yet. The runway came up through sheets of rain, lined on both sides with flashing lights and foam trucks positioned like a grim honor guard of their own. Wren's whole world narrowed to a single white dashed line, and the numbers scrolling down on her altimeter. 500 feet, 200, retarding throttles, she said into the radio, flat, almost gentle, the calm of a woman who had already made peace with what came next. 50. 30. 10. The left main gear slammed onto wet concrete, and the whole airframe shuddered like something alive and furious. She fought the yoke hard left, aileron input holding the crippled right wing up by sheer force of will, balancing 160 tons on a single set of wheels, the way she used to balance an overpowered fighter through a stall, because she had to hold it just a little longer, just until speed bled, 100 knots, 80, and the wing she'd been fighting to hold up finally gave way to gravity, exactly the way she'd known it eventually would. Brace! Metal met concrete in a scream that Wren felt in her teeth, sparks blooming orange against the gray afternoon. The aircraft slewing hard off the centerline into the foam-slicked grass beside the runway. 40 knots, 20, and then stillness. Complete, ringing, impossible stillness, broken only by the tick of cooling engines and rain hammering the cracked windshield glass. Wren's hands, still locked white-knuckled around the yoke, began to shake. She had done it. She had also just told an entire branch of the United States military exactly who she used to be on an open channel with dozens of witnesses and a name she'd buried 12 years ago, now sitting wide awake in the middle of an active investigation she didn't yet know existed. Emergency crews swarmed the fuselage within seconds. Paramedics lifted Captain Hastings out on a stretcher, oxygen mask already fitted, his color a fraction less gray than it had been in the cockpit. Ivy sat down hard on the wet tarmac and wept the way people weep when the adrenaline finally has nowhere left to go. Passengers streamed down the emergency slides in staggered, trembling lines. Principal Delacroix, clutching his briefcase like it was the only solid thing left in his world. 2 district administrators, still holding hands. From somewhere around the 20,000-foot mark, Delia Alcott stumbling the last few feet, and catching herself against a National Guard airman's outstretched arm, her compass pendant swinging wild against her collarbone. Wren climbed down last. Her legs, when they finally took her weight on solid ground, felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. A tall figure in an Air Force flight suit was already crossing the tarmac toward her, helmet under one arm, rain plastering dark hair to his forehead. Young, familiar in a way that made something in Wren's chest tighten before he even spoke. Silas Whitmore stopped a few feet short of her and simply stared, the way you'd stare at something you'd only ever heard about in stories. "Viper," he said. "Quiet, Reverend. You really haven't lost a step." Wren looked past him, toward the smoking wreck of the fuselage half buried in mud, toward the gray sky where 2 Raptors were now circling, waiting for clearance to land. Behind Whitmore, moving fast across the wet concrete, came a man in a command uniform she didn't recognize by rank but recognized instantly by bearing. Because command bearing doesn't change. Not in 12 years. Not ever. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Wren Calloway. His voice cracked, just slightly, on her name. "You have no idea what it took to keep them from putting a missile through your fuselage 20 minutes ago." "I have some idea, Tobias." Major Tobias Kern studied her, the way a man studies a ghost he spent years convincing himself he'd stopped believing in. "There's someone who needs to see this file," he said finally. Quiet enough that only she could hear it. "The gear failure. The drift pattern before you took the yoke." He hesitated, and something in his expression made Wren's stomach turn cold. "It's not the first time I've seen that exact signature, Wren." The rain kept falling. Somewhere behind her, paramedics were still working, and passengers were still being counted off the tarmac one by one, safe, alive, unaware. "Neither have I," Wren said quietly. And for the first time in 12 years, she let herself think June Alcott's name all the way through to the end of the sentence. Because whatever was waiting for her inside that base, whatever file Tobias Kern was so carefully not describing, yet some part of her, buried deep and quiet for over a decade, had already started to understand. The sky was not done with her yet, and neither, it seemed, was the past. The rain didn't stop, not for hours. It just changed rhythm, hard sheets softening into a gray mist that clung to the tarmac at Ashwell Field like it didn't want to let the day end either. Wren stood beneath the overhang of a maintenance hangar. A wool blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching paramedics wheel Captain Hastings toward a waiting medevac helicopter. His color was better. Not good. Better. That would have to be enough for now. Because everything else, the wreckage steaming in the mud 50 yards away. The 2 Raptors taxiing in behind her, like watchful gray shadows. The 41 passengers wrapped in identical blankets being herded toward buses. All of it belonged to a version of the day Wren hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted, hadn't asked for in 12 careful years of building a life specifically designed to never need this version of her again. And yet here she was, Viper, again, whether she liked it or not. Ma'am, a young airman, barely older than her students, appeared at her elbow with a paper cup of coffee that had clearly come from a machine that hated its job. "Colonel wants to see you." "When you're ready, I'm ready." She wasn't, but readiness had never really been a requirement, just a performance. She followed him across the tarmac, past a cluster of passengers being processed by base personnel, with clipboards and gentle, practiced voices, and caught sight of Delia Alcott, sitting on the tailgate of an ambulance, a foil blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring at nothing. Wren didn't stop. Didn't know yet that she should have. There would be time for that later. There was always time for the things that mattered most, right up until there wasn't. The debrief room smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, fluorescent lights, humming overhead in a way that made Wren's eyes ache after a day that had already asked too much of them. A long table, a single manila folder sitting closed in the center of it, like something radioactive. Major Tobias Kern sat across from her, out of his flight gear now, dark circles pressed deep beneath his eyes. He looked older than the boy she remembered training, older than the man who'd just talked 2 Raptors out of shooting her down over the radio. He looked, Wren thought, like a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than one bad day could explain. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you," a tired almost smile. Then it faded, fast, like a light going out. "I owe you an explanation," Kern said, "before this goes any further. Before anyone else walks through that door and tells you a version of events that isn't the whole truth." Wren's stomach tightened, because she knew that sentence. She'd heard sentences like it before, right before the worst days of her life had started. Tobias, Her voice was flat, careful. Just say it. He slid the folder across the table. Didn't open it himself. Just pushed it toward her, the way you'd push something dangerous, away from your own hands and toward someone you trusted more to hold it. That drift pattern, he said. The one that put you into restricted airspace today. I told you on the tarmac I'd seen that signature before. You said it wasn't the first time. It's not. He exhaled slowly through his nose. I pulled the incident report. The second you were on the ground. Because something about the shape of it, the timing, the compounding error, the way it hid inside a normal-looking readout until it wasn't normal anymore. It matched something buried in a classified file I only had clearance to see once, years ago, during an internal review that got shut down before it went anywhere. Wren's hand hovered over the folder. Shut down by who? Open it, Kern said. You'll understand faster than I can explain it. The first page was a systems diagnostic, dense, technical, the kind of document that would put most people to sleep in under a paragraph. Wren read it in 11 seconds. Because she didn't need most people's eyes for this. She needed hers. The ones trained to read flight data, like other people read faces instantly, instinctively, catching the wrongness before the conscious mind even caught up to it. Autopilot logic, a cascading drift error, small at first, invisible for minutes, compounding silently, until correction became structurally impossible. The exact signature, the exact cadence, the exact false confidence readout she'd stared down in the cockpit of Skyline 217 just hours earlier. Except this report wasn't about Skyline 217. The date at the top of the page read 12 years, and 3 months earlier. The aircraft listed wasn't a Boeing 737, it was an F-15E Strike Eagle, tail number 4471. Wren had flown that tail number, not that day, not that mission. But she knew it. She'd have known it in her sleep. She had run her hand along that exact fuselage 100 times before dawn launches, had watched June Alcott climb into that exact cockpit with the same reckless half-grin she wore into everything. Because it belonged to June. The room went very quiet, very fast. The fluorescent hum suddenly the loudest thing in it. No. Wren heard her own voice from somewhere very far away. No, that can't be right. June's aircraft went down over hostile territory. Enemy fire. That was the official report. That was the report I signed off on. That was the report I have spent 12 years believing. It was the official report, Kern said carefully. It was also incomplete. Incomplete how? There was a systems failure in June's aircraft before the engagement even started. Kern's jaw worked, like the words was costing him something physical to say out loud. A cascading autopilot fault. Nearly identical to what happened to your Boeing today. It compromised her targeting and navigation systems in the final minutes before contact. It's possible, likely, based on the diagnostic, that the failure contributed directly to what happened. Not enemy skill, not bad luck, a defect. Wren's hands had gone very still on the tabletop. Because still was easier than shaking. Still was a choice her body made when the alternative was falling apart in a room with fluorescent lights and a man she used to outrank. Why, she said, and her voice had dropped into a register. Kern had clearly never heard from her before, not even on the radio hours earlier. Why would that be buried? Why would anyone bury a defect that killed a pilot? Kern didn't answer right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. There's a name on the internal review, he said finally. The one that got shut down. Contractor. Halberd Systems Group. They built the flight control software for that generation of aircraft. He paused. They also hold the current maintenance and software contract for the commercial charter fleet, operating out of 3 regional airports in New England. Wren felt something cold settle behind her ribs, including Thornfield Regional. Who signed off on closing the review. Wren's voice had gone very quiet, very precise, the way it used to sound in mission briefings when a plan started falling apart and someone needed to sound calmer than they felt. There's always a name, Tobias. Somebody's signature ends an investigation like that. Kern hesitated. It was the same hesitation from the tarmac, the one that told Wren more than his words did. I don't have full access to that page yet, he said. The signature line was redacted in the version I could pull. I've requested the unredacted file through proper channels. It'll take days. Maybe longer if somebody upstairs decides to slow walk it. Somebody upstairs like who? I don't know yet. He met her eyes. But I intend to find out. Wren sat back in her chair, 12 years of carefully rebuilt architecture groaning under a weight it had never been designed to hold, because she had built an entire life, a whole, deliberate, quiet life, on the belief that June's death had been clean. Tragic, yes. Devastating, yes. But clean. A cost of war paid in full, nothing left owing, if that wasn't true. If somebody had known and buried it and let Wren carry 12 years of grief shaped by a lie, she didn't let herself finish that thought, not yet. It had teeth she wasn't ready to feel. So let me understand this. Wren's voice had gone dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that used to make junior pilots straighten their spines without being told. A defective flight system contributed to June's death 12 years ago. Someone buried the review, and the same company that built that system has been quietly running commercial aircraft with the exact same vulnerability. For over a decade, including the plane I was on today. That's what the data suggests. Suggests. I don't have proof of intent yet, Kern said. I have a diagnostic pattern and a shutdown review and a very uncomfortable coincidence sitting in front of both of us. That's not the same as proof. It's enough for me. It's not enough for a court-martial, or a federal investigation, or anything that will actually hold anyone accountable. Kern leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for a moment he looked less like a major, and more like the frightened trainee she remembered chewing out over a loose diamond formation a lifetime ago. Wren. If we move on this wrong, if we move too fast, too loud, without airtight evidence, Halberd has lawyers who will bury this so deep it never sees daylight again. And you'll have blown your cover for nothing. Wren stood, because sitting still had stopped being possible. June is not nothing, she said. I didn't say she was. Then don't tell me to be careful with the truth about how she died. Wren's voice cracked, just slightly. On the word died the first time in 12 years, she'd said it out loud, without flinching preemptively. I have spent 12 years grading physics quizzes and pretending I don't know what a Sidewinder missile sounds like locking onto an airframe. I did that because I believed she died doing her job, cleanly, honorably, and there was nothing left for me to fix. If that's not true, she stopped herself, because the sentence had a shape she wasn't ready to finish yet. If that's not true, then 12 years of grief have been built on the wrong foundation. And grief built on the wrong foundation doesn't just collapse quietly, it takes you down with it. Kern watched her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. There's one more thing, he said quietly. You should probably sit back down for this one. I'm fine standing, Wren. His voice was gentle in a way that scared her more than anything that had happened in the cockpit hours earlier. The squadron commander who signed June's original loss report. The one who told her family. Who told you? Grant Ashmore. Grant Ashmore is a colonel now, full bird 3 years ago. Kern's jaw tightened. He sits on a defense contracting oversight board. The same board that reviews Halberd Systems Group's federal contracts every fiscal cycle. The room tilted, just slightly, the way it had tilted once before on a runway when a wing had finally, inevitably, dropped. Wren sat back down. Not because Kern had asked, because her legs required it. She found the young nurse from the flight in the base's medical wing an hour later. Not by design. Not exactly. Wren had gone looking for coffee that didn't taste like burnt rubber, and instead found Delia Alcott sitting alone in a hallway chair outside the room where Captain Hastings was being stabilized. Her scrubs still faintly damp from the evacuation. The small gold compass pendant still clutched in one fist, like a talisman she couldn't put down. You're the one who flew the plane, Delia said, before Wren had even fully registered her presence. Her voice was rough, wrung out the teacher. Everyone's saying they're saying you used to fly fighter jets. I did. Wren sat down 2 chairs away, gave the girl space. Some instinct old, careful, half-forgotten told her this conversation needed room to breathe. A long time ago. They're saying your call sign was Viper. It was. Delia's fingers tightened around the pendant. My mom used to say that name, she said, and her voice cracked right down the middle in her sleep. When I was a kid, she'd say it like it hurt her to say it. I used to think it was a person's name. Nobody ever told me who Viper was. I just grew up thinking it was some old nightmare she never talked about. Wren's entire body went very, very still, because the room had just tilted sideways, and she hadn't seen it coming, and there was no yoke in her hands to correct for it. What was your mother's name? Wren asked, and she already knew. She already knew the way you know the ground is about to meet you, half a second before the fall actually lands. June. Delia looked up, eyes glassy, exhausted, grieving something she'd carried her whole life, without a name for it. June Alcott. She died before I was old enough to really remember her voice properly. Car accident, they told me, when I was 2. Car accident, not enemy fire, not classified, not a fighter jet screaming into hostile ground 12 years ago in a mission that never officially existed. A car accident. 2 entirely different lies, stitched onto 2 entirely different lives, and somewhere underneath both of them, an entire truth that neither Wren nor this grieving young woman had ever been given. Delia. Wren's voice had gone soft in a way it almost never went. Soft the way you'd hold something you were terrified of breaking. I knew your mother. Delia went very still. You what? June Alcott was my wingman. Wren swallowed hard. 12 years of careful silence cracking open all at once. Right here, in a fluorescent hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. My best friend. We flew together, trained together. I was there the day she stopped, because she genuinely didn't know anymore how that sentence was supposed to end. I was there the day she died, except she hadn't been. Not really. She'd been told June died. She'd signed paperwork that said June died. She'd built 12 years of grief, on top of a report that Tobias Kern had just told her, an hour ago, in a room with bad coffee, might not even be true. You knew her. Delia's voice had gone very small. You actually knew my mom. I did. Wren reached out, slowly, and closed her hand over Delia's, the one, still holding the compass pendant, knuckles white, with the effort of holding onto something that had outlived the woman who gave it to her. This was hers, wasn't it? Delia nodded, unable to speak. She wore one just like it, Wren said. Every mission. For luck. She used to say a compass only works if you actually trust it, and most people don't trust anything enough to let it guide them. Her voice caught. She was the bravest person I ever knew, Delia. Whatever they told you about how she died, I need you to know that. She was extraordinary. Delia was crying now. Quiet, exhausted tears, the kind that come after a day too long and too strange to process in real time. Nobody ever tells me anything about her, she whispered. My grandparents wouldn't talk about it. There's like a 5-year gap in everything I know about my own mother. I used to think maybe she did something wrong. Maybe that's why nobody would say her name. She didn't do anything wrong. Wren's jaw tightened, old grief curdling fast into something sharper, something with teeth. If what I'm starting to learn today turns out to be true, she didn't fail anybody. Somebody failed her. Delia wiped her face with the back of her hand, a small, fierce motion that reminded Wren so sharply of June. It physically hurt. Somebody, she repeated. You keep saying somebody. Do you know who? Not yet. Wren held her gaze steadily. But I intend to find out, and when I do, I promise you, you'll be the first person I tell. Not the last. Not the one who finds out from a stranger in a hospital hallway, 12 years too late. The first. It was, she realized as she said it, the first promise she had made to anyone in years that she had absolutely no idea about to keep. She meant every word of it anyway. Marcus Vane arrived at Ashwell Field 2 hours after the crash landing, and Wren knew who he was before anyone introduced him. Not by face, by posture, because there's a particular way certain men walk into a room after a disaster, not rushed, not concerned, but managed, like the crisis itself was simply a scheduling inconvenience they'd already budgeted time to smooth over. He wore a gray suit that cost more than Wren's monthly salary, and carried a leather portfolio he hadn't opened once. Mid-50s. Silver at the temples in a way that looked expensive rather than earned. He introduced himself to Colonel Harlan Boyce, the base commander, with a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Marcus Vane," he said, voice smooth as poured concrete, Director of Systems Integrity, Halberd Systems Group. "We hold the maintenance and software contract for the aircraft involved in today's incident. I flew in the moment we received notification. We take an event like this extremely seriously." Wren, standing at the edge of the room with her arms folded, felt every hair on the back of her neck rise at once. Because she recognized the shape of that sentence too. "We take this extremely seriously" was corporate, for we are already building the version of this story that protects us. "Mr. Vane." Colonel Boyce, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered granite, gestured toward the table. "This is Miss Calloway. She's the passenger who assumed control of the aircraft." Vane's eyes settled on Wren, and something behind them recalculated fast, subtle, the kind of adjustment you'd only catch if you'd spent years learning to read micro-expressions across a cockpit canopy at 400 knots. "Miss Calloway." He extended a hand. "Remarkable work today. Truly. Halberd will of course be covering all costs related to—" "I don't want your money." Wren didn't take the hand. "I want to know why your autopilot logic pushed a commercial aircraft into a restricted military zone today, using a failure pattern that's been sitting in a classified file for 12 years. The room went very quiet. Vane's smile didn't move, which was, somehow, worse than if it had. "I'm not aware of what file you're referring to," he said smoothly. "Our systems undergo rigorous F-15E. Tail number 4471. Wren's voice was flat and clean. A scalpel instead of a hammer. 12 years ago. A cascading autopilot fault in the final minutes before an engagement went bad. Sound familiar, Mr. Vane?" For exactly 1 second something flickered behind Marcus Vane's eyes. Fear, fast, controlled, buried again almost as quickly as it surfaced. But Wren had spent 5 years reading enemy pilots' hesitation through radar static, and she caught it anyway. "I have no knowledge of that incident," Vane said, and his voice had gone very slightly too careful, too rehearsed. "Halberd complies fully with all federal aviation and defense oversight requirements. If you have documentation suggesting otherwise, I'd strongly encourage you to route it through the appropriate legal channels." Making unsubstantiated claims in a room like this, particularly given the sensitivity of today's events, could open you up to significant liability, Miss Calloway. There it was, not a denial. A threat wearing a denial's clothes. Wren smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "That sounded less like a fact," she said, "and more like a warning. It's advice. I don't take advice from men who show up 2 hours after a plane nearly crashed wearing a suit that expensive." Wren stepped closer, close enough that Vane's practiced composure flickered again, visibly this time. "I flew that aircraft down on one wheel today, Mr. Vane. I've buried people I loved because of systems failures nobody wanted to admit to. I am not currently in the mood for advice. Miss Calloway." Colonel Boyce's voice, low and warning. "Let's keep this productive." Wren didn't back down. But she did step back, because there was a difference between holding ground and picking a fight she wasn't ready to win yet. Vane straightened his jacket, recomposing himself with visible effort. "I understand emotions are high," he said, addressing the colonel now, deliberately routing around Wren entirely. "Halberd will conduct a full internal review of today's incident and cooperate fully with any federal inquiry. That's all I can offer at this time." He gathered his unopened portfolio. "If you'll excuse me, I have calls to make." He paused at the door, half turning back, and for just a moment the smooth mask slipped again, just enough for Wren to see something underneath it that looked almost like exhaustion. "For what it's worth, Miss Calloway," he said quietly, "not everyone who works inside a system built the walls of it." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final click that felt, somehow, louder than it should have. Kern waited until it closed fully before speaking. "That went about as well as I expected." He scared. Wren was still staring at the closed door, jaw tight. Under all that suit and all that polish. "He's scared, Tobias. Which means there's something real to be scared of." She turned. "And that last thing he said. Not everyone who works inside a system built the walls of it. That's not a denial. That's a confession dressed up as a philosophy. Which also means, Kern said quietly, he's going to move fast to bury it. Faster than we can, probably, if we're stuck waiting on federal paperwork. Wren turned. Something had shifted behind her eyes, the old calculation returning, the one that used to plan strike routes through hostile airspace with nothing but a map and 40 minutes of fuel to spare. Then we don't wait on federal paperwork. Ren June died because somebody decided a defect was cheaper to bury than to fix. Her voice had gone low, dangerous, absolutely certain. I nearly died today because that same defect never got fixed. And there's a 24-year-old nurse 3 doors down, who's spent her whole life not knowing why her mother's name made grown adults go silent. I am done letting this stay buried, Tobias. Whatever it takes. Captain Hastings woke briefly, just before 9 that evening, long enough for a nurse to fetch Wren from the hallway, where she'd been keeping an unofficial, unrequested vigil. His eyes found her immediately, some fragment of memory from the cockpit apparently still intact beneath the sedation. You, he rasped. You're the one who took the yoke. I am, saved my life. His hand, weak and papery, found hers on the bed rail, saved everybody's life. You'd have done the same, Wren said gently, if you'd been able to. 30 years flying. His eyes were wet, exhausted, grateful in a way that had nothing left to hide behind. 30 years, and I never once needed a passenger to save my aircraft. Who are you? Wren almost gave him the easy answer, the teacher answer, the one she'd practiced for 12 years until it fit like a second skin. Instead, for reasons she didn't fully examine in the moment, she gave him something closer to the truth. Someone who used to fly for a living, she said, a long time ago. I hoped I'd never need those skills again. Well, Hastings's mouth twitched, something almost like a smile finding its way through the exhaustion. Glad you kept them anyway. So am I, Wren said, and meant it more than she expected to. She sat with him, until the sedation pulled him back under, and then she sat a while longer after that, in the particular quiet of a hospital room at night, thinking about all the ways a life could be saved, and all the ways a life could still, somehow, remain unfinished business. Night fell hard and early over Ashwell Field, rain finally slowing to a fine, persistent mist that beaded on the hangar windows like the sky itself was still trying to process the day. Wren found herself in the base's small chapel just after 10. Not because she was religious, she wasn't. Not really. Hadn't been since a desert deployment had burned most of that certainty out of her. But because it was quiet and dim, and nobody would look at her there, like she was either a hero or a threat. She sat in the back pew, the wool blanket still around her shoulders, and let herself finally shake. Because she'd held it together for 14 hours. 14 hours of collapsed pilots and jammed landing gear and F-22s with missiles armed and pointed at her fuselage, and a name she'd buried for 12 years dragged back into daylight by a manila folder and a grieving young nurse's compass pendant. She was allowed to shake now. Nobody was watching, except somebody was. Figured I'd find you somewhere quiet. Kern's voice low from the doorway. He didn't come closer, just stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light, giving her the same careful space she'd given Delia hours earlier. You okay? No. The honesty surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. I don't think I have been, actually, for about 12 years. I just got very good at pretending otherwise. Kern was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the small room and sat down in the pew ahead of hers, half turned so he could still see her face. For what it's worth, he said, I never believed the official story fit you, even back when I was a green lieutenant terrified of your call sign. You never left anybody behind. Not once. Not in 3 years of watching you fly. I left June behind. Wren's voice cracked on the sentence. 12 years of certainty finally fully breaking apart. That's the story I've told myself every single day since. That I wasn't fast enough. Wasn't good enough. That some split-second decision I made cost her everything. What if that's not what happened at all? Then I don't know what I've been grieving for 12 years. Wren pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, willing the tears back, the way she'd willed them back 1,000 times before, and failing, this time, for the first time, in longer than she could remember. I don't know how to grieve a lie, Tobias. I only know how to grieve the truth. And I don't even know what the truth is anymore. There's something else, he said finally. I wasn't going to tell you tonight. You've had enough for one day, but I don't think I can sit on it, given everything else that's happened. Wren's whole body tensed. Tell me. The internal review that got shut down 12 years ago. Kern stepped further into the chapel, voice dropping lower, like the walls themselves might be listening. I said it never went anywhere. That's not entirely true. It went somewhere. It just got sealed instead of closed, which means the file still exists, which means somebody, somewhere, decided it was safer to hide the truth than destroy it. Why would they hide it instead of destroying it? Kern hesitated. And in that hesitation, Wren felt something shift again, the ground tilting under her for the second time that day. Because destroying evidence is a crime you can get caught for, Kern said quietly. Sealing it and burying the person who might expose it is just quieter. Wren's blood went cold. Tobias, her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. What exactly are you telling me? He met her eyes, and for the first time all day, she saw something in his face that looked almost like guilt. I'm telling you the recovery report on June's aircraft has some irregularities I can't explain yet, he said carefully. Inconsistencies in the wreckage assessment. A recovery timeline that doesn't fully add up. He exhaled, slow and unsteady. I'm not saying anything for certain, Wren. I don't have proof of anything. But I've spent 12 years assuming a story was finished. Today made me question whether it ever really ended at all. Somewhere outside the chapel, thunder rolled low and distant over the coastline. There's one more name, Kern added, quiet, careful, watching her face as he said it. I mentioned Grant Ashmore signed the original loss report. What I didn't tell you is that his signature also appears 3 times on internal Halberd correspondence from around the same period. Nothing damning on its own. Could be routine liaison work. Could be coincidence. You don't believe that? No, Kern admitted, I don't. Wren sat very still in the dark, feeling 12 years of carefully buried grief begin, impossibly, to crack open into something that might not be grief at all. Something that might instead be hope. And hope, she remembered now, had always been more dangerous than fear, because fear only asked you to survive. Hope asked you to believe again, and believing again meant risking everything a second time. She didn't sleep that night, not in any real sense, dozed in fits on a cot in the base's temporary housing wing. Jolting awake twice with her heart hammering, and her hand already reaching for a yoke that wasn't there. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she gave up entirely and sat by the small window instead, watching rain slide down the glass in slow, silver threads, thinking about a mess hall conversation 12 years old. You live entirely inside the next 40 minutes, June had told her. One day the next 40 minutes are gonna run out, and you're gonna need to know what comes after. Wren had spent 12 years believing the next 40 minutes had already run out, that there was no after. That grief was the only country left to live in. Sitting in the dark, watching a storm finally begin to loosen its grip on the coast, she allowed herself, for the first time, to wonder if she'd been wrong. By morning, she promised herself she would know more than she did tonight. She had no idea yet how true that promise would turn out to be, or how completely it would rewrite everything she thought she understood about the last 12 years of her life. Morning came gray and reluctant over Ashwell Field, the storm finally spent, leaving behind a sky the color of old pewter and a runway still scarred, with the long black gouge Wren's landing had carved into it the day before. She hadn't slept. Not really. Because how do you sleep when the last 12 years of your life have just been quietly rewritten by a manila folder and a stranger's compass pendant? How do you close your eyes when somewhere in this building a file exists that might prove your best friend didn't die the way you were told? When you don't yet know if hope is a gift, or just grief wearing a different face. You don't. You just wait for the sun, and let your body go through the motions instead. By 7 a.m., she was back in Colonel Boyce's office. Kern was already there, standing rather than sitting, a fresh stack of printouts under one arm. So was Delia, uninvited but unwilling to be sent away. Sitting stiff and pale in the corner chair, with her mother's pendant wrapped twice around her fist. And so was the file, sealed, red-stamped, sitting in the center of the table like something that might detonate if handled wrong. I need to say this clearly. Boyce's voice was granite, careful granite. What's in this file was sealed under an internal review classification. Opening it without proper authorization is not a small thing. If I break this seal, there's no putting it back together. Whatever we find, we're obligated to act on. All of us. No exceptions. No matter whose name is on the next page. Neither is a woman flying a broken airliner into restricted airspace because a defect nobody fixed 12 years ago just tried to kill her a second time. Wren didn't sit. Couldn't, Colonel. Respectfully, I already paid the price of not knowing. I'm done paying it. Boyce studied her for a long moment, then looked at Kern. Major, your assessment, Kern said. No hesitation. Boyce broke the seal. The first page was routine. Recovery coordinates, wreckage description, the kind of clinical language that flattens tragedy into paperwork so nobody has to feel it while they file it. The second page changed everything, because the recovery timeline didn't match. Because the wreckage assessment listed damage patterns inconsistent with an ejection under hostile fire. Because a single line, buried in a paragraph of dry technical jargon, made Wren's whole body go cold in a way December in Vermont never had. Pilot remains not recovered at primary crash site. Secondary search suspended by directive. Case closed per Halberd Systems liaison recommendation. Suspended. Wren's voice came out cracked. Raw, they suspended the search. On whose authority? Kern's jaw was tight. Keep reading. The next page was a memo. Internal. Halberd letterhead. Dated 11 days after June's aircraft went down. Recommend immediate closure of search operation to avoid further exposure of Flight Systems Division liability. Continued search risks recovery of black box, data inconsistent with combat loss narrative. Wren read it twice. Then a third time, because her mind refused to accept it the first two. Because this wasn't a defect anymore. This wasn't an accident buried by cowardice and bureaucracy. This was a decision, a cold, deliberate, signed decision to stop looking for a downed pilot. Because finding her might have proven the truth. They stopped searching for her. Wren's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Because finding her body, finding the black box, might have proven their software killed her instead of the enemy. So, they just stopped. Nobody in the room spoke. Until Delia did. Are you saying? The young nurse's voice shook, fragile as glass about to give. Are you saying nobody actually confirmed my mother died? They just decided to stop looking and called it done. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Boyce turned to the final page of the memo, and his weathered face went very still. There's a signature block here. His voice had changed, gone careful in a way Wren had never heard from him before. Authorizing officer for search suspension. He looked up, and whatever he saw in Wren's face made him hesitate before finishing. Colonel Grant Ashmore, squadron commander of record. Wren felt the floor tilt beneath her for the second time in 2 days, because Grant Ashmore hadn't just signed June's loss report 12 years ago. He'd signed the order to stop looking for her while she might still have been alive. What happened next happened fast. The way things always seem to happen fast once the truth finally breaks the surface after being held underwater for years. Boyce authorized an emergency federal notification within the hour. Kern flagged the file directly to the Inspector General's office, bypassing 3 layers of chain of command that would have otherwise buried it in procedure for weeks. And Wren did the one thing she'd promised herself 12 years ago she would never do again. She called Colonel Grant Ashmore. He answered on the second ring, and something in his voice too smooth, too immediately reassuring, told Wren everything she needed to know before he'd said a single real sentence. Wren, God, it's been years. I heard about yesterday. Remarkable work. Truly, we're all just, did you know? Silence just long enough. Did you know? Wren said again, quiet and lethal, that the search for June was suspended on Halberd's recommendation. Not because they'd confirmed her death, because continuing might have exposed their liability. And that your signature authorized it. Wren, I don't know what you think you've found, But classified reviews are complicated. There are protocols. You signed the loss report, Grant. Her voice cracked down the center now. 12 years of grief curdling fast into something with teeth. You told me she was gone. You told her family she was gone. You told a 2-year-old daughter, indirectly, through every silence and every unanswered question, for the rest of her childhood, that her mother was gone. Did you know it wasn't confirmed, or did you just not want to ask the question? Another silence, longer this time. There were pressures, Ashmore said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier warmth, gone thin and defensive instead. Budget cycles, contract renewals. Halberd Software ran half our fleet's targeting systems at the time. A public failure would have grounded aircraft across 3 commands during an active deployment. People were making impossible calculations under enormous pressure, Wren. You weren't in that room? No, Wren said. I was in a different room, grieving a woman you might have let die a second time by giving up on finding her the first time. She hung up without waiting for him to find the words to lie again. Her hands, when she finally looked down at them, were shaking harder than they had on the runway the day before. Marcus Vane returned to Ashwell Field by noon, summoned, this time, not volunteering, and the difference in his posture told its own story. Less managed, more brittle. A man who'd spent the night on the phone with lawyers instead of sleeping, his gray suit rumpled now in a way it hadn't been the day before, like even the fabric had stopped believing its own composure. Colonel Boyce, Kern, an Inspector General field investigator, flown in that morning, and Wren sat across the table from him. Delia stood near the wall, arms crossed tight over her chest, unwilling to be anywhere else. This is a closed federal matter now, Mr. Vane. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata Okafor, slid copies of the memo across the table. I'd strongly recommend full cooperation before this becomes a criminal matter instead of a regulatory one. Vane stared at the memo, stared at his own company's letterhead, stared at a sentence he'd probably hoped had been shredded a decade ago. For a long moment, the practiced composure didn't crack. Then it did. We didn't create the defect maliciously. His voice had lost its polish entirely now, something rawer underneath it finally showing through. The cascading fault was a manufacturing oversight, a bad batch of control chips. It was going to cost millions to recall and retrofit an entire fleet generation. Millions the company didn't have without collapsing. Thousands of jobs, Miss Calloway. That was the calculation on the table. So you let a pilot die instead. Wren's voice was ice, and then let her daughter grow up believing a lie, so your balance sheet could survive. That is not. Vane stopped, swallowed, started again quieter. That decision was made above my position at the time. I inherited the cover-up, Miss Calloway. I didn't build it, but I have spent 10 years protecting it, because by the time I understood what I was protecting, I was already too deep inside it to get out clean. That's not an excuse. Delia's voice from the wall, sharp and shaking. That's a confession. Vane looked at her, really looked for the first time, and something in his face folded. You're her daughter, he said quietly. You have her eyes. Don't. Delia's voice cracked. Don't you dare talk about her like you knew her. You let people believe she was dead for the wrong reason for 12 years. You don't get to look at me like that means something to you now. Vane had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Okafor slid a fresh document across the table, deliberate, unhurried. Mr. Vane, I need you to understand exactly where you're standing. Full cooperation, complete disclosure. Every name in that chain of command, that path leads to a plea agreement. Continued obstruction leads somewhere considerably worse. For you personally, whatever protection you think your position affords you. She tapped the page once. I suggest you choose carefully. You've had 10 years to think about which side of this you wanted to be on. You're out of time to keep deciding later. Vane looked at the document for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached for the pen Okafor had set beside it. Ask your questions, he said quietly. All of them. I'm done protecting people who never once protected me from what I'd become inside that company. The confession, once it started, didn't stop. Vane gave up the full internal chain. The executives who'd authorized the search suspension, the falsified maintenance logs that had kept the same defective autopilot architecture quietly running across 3 regional charter fleets. For over a decade, the payments made to keep 2 prior whistleblowers silent, the specific conversations in which Grant Ashmore's name had come up not as an obstacle to the cover-up, but as one of its earliest and most cooperative architects. Investigator Okafor filled 3 notebooks before lunch. "There's one more thing." Vane's voice had gone quieter, almost hesitant, the practiced smoothness completely gone now, replaced by something that looked, to Wren's surprise, uncomfortably close to genuine remorse. "Something that might matter more to you than any of this." "Go on," Okafor said. "The recovery search that was suspended." Vane looked directly at Wren now, not at the investigator. "I reviewed the field logs myself years ago, when I first took over this division and started quietly digging into what I'd inherited. I never told anyone what I found. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix. I've regretted that decision for years." "What did you find?" Wren said, and her voice had gone very still. "The search wasn't suspended because there was nothing left to find." Vane's hands, resting on the table, had begun to tremble slightly. It was suspended 11 days in. There'd already been a preliminary field report from a local recovery team before Halberd's recommendation memo went out. That report noted the primary crash site showed signs consistent with a survivable ejection, partial canopy separation. A deployed parachute recovered nearly 4 kilometers from the main wreckage. The room had gone completely silent. "You're telling me," Wren said, each word deliberate, careful, like she was walking across ice she didn't trust, "that there was physical evidence June might have survived the crash, and somebody buried that too." "I'm telling you," Vane said quietly, "that I don't know what happened to her after that. Nobody continued the search long enough to find out. But the evidence that existed at the time did not support a conclusion of It supported, at minimum, an open question, one that was closed anyway, because an open question was more dangerous to certain people than a quiet, permanent, false certainty." Delia had both hands pressed over her mouth now, tears streaming silently down her face. Wren didn't move. Couldn't, for a long moment, do anything but sit very still and let 12 years of carefully constructed grief begin to come apart at every seam simultaneously. She found Kern in the hallway during the recess that followed, staring at a printout with an expression she couldn't quite read. Tobias. He looked up, and something in his face made her stomach drop and lift at exactly the same moment. "I ran the coordinates from the original recovery attempt." The second Vane mentioned the parachute, he said slowly, "cross-referenced against a humanitarian NGO database. Standard procedure. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything this fast." He hesitated. "There's a match, Wren. A Jane Doe. Admitted to a field hospital 11 days after June's aircraft went down. Severe injuries. No identification. Discharged herself before full records could be processed." Wren couldn't breathe. "Where?" "A relief clinic near the extraction zone. Run by an international aid group, not military." Kern's hands weren't quite steady either. The physical description in the intake notes. Age, build, an old shoulder injury consistent with an ejection seat impact. He looked up at her, and his voice dropped to something barely audible. "Wren, I think she survived the crash." The hallway tilted. Wren gripped the wall, because her legs had briefly forgotten how to hold her up. 12 years of buried grief, and one impossible sentence colliding somewhere behind her ribs with enough force to knock the air clean out of her lungs. "That doesn't mean she's still." Wren couldn't even finish the sentence. Didn't want to jinx it by saying alive out loud, like the word itself might scare the possibility away. 11 years is a long time, Tobias. People disappear, people change their names. People sometimes don't want to be found, for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they love you. I know. He met her eyes, steady now, deliberate. "But I already put a request in with the aid organization's records office. If there's a trail, any trail at all, I am going to find it." Delia appeared in the hallway behind them, having clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand its shape, her face a mixture of terror and something that looked dangerously, achingly like hope. You think my mother might be alive? It wasn't a question. It was a fact she was testing out loud, carefully, like a bone she wasn't sure had healed yet. I think, Wren said slowly, that we owe it to her, and to you, to find out, for certain. However long it takes. It took 6 days. 6 days of federal statements, of watching Marcus Vane get led out of Ashwell Field in handcuffs under a gray morning sky, his composure finally, fully gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. 6 days of watching Halberd Systems Group's stock crater across every business channel. Delia refused to stop checking on her phone, of federal agents descending on the company's headquarters with warrants thick enough to require a hand truck. 6 days of Grant Ashmore's formal suspension pending court-martial proceedings, of a statement read outside a Pentagon briefing room that used words like regrettable and under review and did not once use the word sorry. 6 days of Wren teaching, impossibly, ordinary physics classes back in Thornfield, standing at a whiteboard, talking about velocity, and forced to teenagers who had no idea their quiet teacher had spent the previous week helping unravel a federal conspiracy. Marnie brought over a casserole on the third night and asked no questions, which was, Wren thought, its own kind of grace. 6 days of not letting herself hope too loudly, because hope that loud had teeth, and she'd already been bitten once. On the 7th day, Kern called. We found her. 2 words. That was all it took for the classroom around Wren to blur into meaningless noise. For 12 years of carefully rebuilt walls to come down all at once, silent and total, like a controlled demolition, finally given permission to fall. Where? Her voice didn't sound like her own. A small town outside Missoula, Montana. Kern's voice was thick with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. She's been living under a different name for years. No military contact, no family contact. The trauma, the injuries, Wren. From what the records show, she didn't remember who she was for a long time. Not fully. Traumatic amnesia, compounded by the head injury from the ejection. It's only in the last few years that pieces started coming back to her on their own. Wren sat down hard on the edge of her desk. 29 physics students staring at her with wide, confused eyes, and she didn't care. Didn't care at all. Does she know? Wren whispered. Does she know about Delia? She's asking, Kern said quietly. She's been asking for years, apparently. Just didn't know how to find her. Didn't know if she had the right to once she started remembering enough to understand what she'd walked away from without meaning to. Wren closed her eyes. Does she know about me? There was a pause on the line, gentle and careful. She asked about you first, Kern said. Before anything else. Before Delia, even. She wanted to know if Viper made it home okay. Wren pressed a hand over her mouth. 12 years of grief finally, impossibly, cracking wide open into something that wasn't grief at all anymore. Because 12 years of grief doesn't just evaporate the moment you learn it was built on a lie. It has to be unbuilt, piece by piece, the same slow, careful way it was built in the first place. But it can be unbuilt. That, she realized, sitting on the edge of a desk in a Vermont classroom, with her whole chest cracking open, was the only thing that mattered right now. They met at Ashwell Field again, because it was neutral ground, because it was the only place that made any kind of narrative sense, because some reunions need a runway underneath them the way some goodbyes do. Wren stood at the edge of the tarmac with Delia beside her, both of them watching a small charter aircraft civilian, unremarkable, nothing like the fighter jets that had once defined all their lives taxi in from the private terminal. Kern stood a respectful distance back, arms folded, having quietly arranged the entire flight through channels. Wren suspected he'd never fully explain, and she'd never fully ask him to. Delia's hand found Wren's without either of them deciding to reach for it. I don't know what to say to her. Delia's voice was barely a whisper, thin with 12 years of unanswered questions suddenly, impossibly, about to be answered. I don't even remember her voice. I have like 3 photographs. That's it. That's my whole mother. You don't have to know what to say. Wren squeezed her hand. You just have to be here. The rest comes after. How do you know that? Wren thought of a mess hall conversation 12 years old, a reckless half-grin, a fork pointed at her across a table. "Because someone once told me that's how it works," she said softly. "I didn't understand it for a very long time. I think I finally do now." The aircraft door opened, and a woman stepped out thinner than Wren remembered, hair gone gray at the temples far too early, a faint scar tracing along one side of her jaw that hadn't been there 12 years ago. She moved carefully, like someone still relearning trust in her own body. One hand braced lightly against the door frame before she committed to the steps. But her eyes were exactly the same, June. Wren's voice broke completely on the single syllable. 12 years compressed into one word, and she was moving before she'd consciously decided to. Crossing the tarmac, at something between a walk and a run, June Alcott stopped. Stared, and for one suspended, breathless second, neither of them could quite believe the other was real. Viper June's voice cracked rough with disuse and emotion in equal measure. "You got old." A laugh tore out of Wren, half sob, half genuine delight, and then they were holding onto each other in the middle of an Air Force tarmac. 12 years of grief and guilt, and unspoken goodbye finally allowed to just be relief instead. "I thought you were dead." Wren's voice was muffled against June's shoulder. "I have spent 12 years thinking I let you die. I know." June pulled back just enough to look at her properly, hands still gripping Wren's arms like she needed the physical proof. "Tobias told me, on the phone. I made him say it twice, because I couldn't believe you'd actually carried that." Her voice cracked. "You didn't let me die, Wren. Nobody let anybody die. Some very expensive lawyers decided my life was cheaper than their quarterly earnings, and everybody else just had to live with what that decision cost. That's not on you. It was never on you. I signed the loss report acceptance." Wren's voice was shaking now, something she hadn't allowed herself in front of anyone in longer than she could remember. "I stood at a memorial and said your name out loud and let people believe it was finished. I should have asked more questions. I should have fought harder. You were told there was nothing left to fight for." June's hands came up to frame Wren's face, gentle and fierce at once. "You didn't fail me, Wren Calloway. You grieved me the way anybody grieves somebody they love. That's not a crime. The crime happened somewhere else, by people who will never understand what it cost either of us." Behind them, Delia hadn't moved, frozen at the edge of the tarmac, one hand pressed to her mouth, the compass pendant swinging loose from her fist. June's eyes found her, and everything else in the world went quiet. "Delia." June's voice broke completely this time, no composure left to hold on to. "God, you're so tall. You were 2. You were barely 2 years old the last time I—" She couldn't finish, didn't need to. Delia crossed the tarmac in 4 unsteady steps, and simply folded into her mother's arms, both of them sinking slightly at the knees. 12 years of absence collapsing into a single embrace that neither of them seemed willing to end. "I have your pendant," Delia said into her mother's shoulder, voice thick. "I've had it my whole life. I never knew the whole story. I just knew I wasn't allowed to take it off. It found its way back to you anyway." June pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, tears falling freely now onto hair, the same shade her own had been before grief, and time had touched it gray. "I used to tell myself that meant something, that it was still connecting us, even when I didn't remember why." Wren stood a few feet back, watching, and let herself cry for the first time since this entire impossible week had started, because grief, it turned out, wasn't the only thing that could ambush you out of nowhere. So could joy. The federal case against Halberd Systems Group and its dismantled cover-up made national news within the month. Congressional hearings, a class action suit on behalf of every family affected by the same buried defect, a formal Air Force apology that finally, publicly, used the word failed instead of regrettable. Grant Ashmore's court-martial proceedings began in early spring, the outcome uncertain but the truth, at last, no longer negotiable. None of it undid 12 years. Wren understood that clearly, standing in a congressional hallway one gray February afternoon after giving testimony that would be quoted in newspapers she'd never bother to read. None of it gave June back the decade she'd lost to amnesia, and a false name in a small Montana town. None of it gave Delia the childhood she should have had, full of a mother's voice instead of 3 photographs and an unexplained silence. But it gave them something. A door back open, where before there had only been a wall. That, Wren decided, was not nothing. Some days it felt like almost everything. 3 weeks later, Thornfield looked exactly the way it always did. In late autumn, maple leaves burning red and gold along Main Street, the crooked church steeple catching the low afternoon light, Marnie Ostrander leaning over the fence with 2 coffees before Wren had even made it to her car. So, Marnie handed one over, eyebrows raised. Fighter pilot. 5 confirmed kills, saved an entire airplane, brought down a defense contractor and a colonel in the same week. You gonna tell me any of this yourself? Or am I gonna keep finding out from the news like everybody else in town? I was going to tell you, Wren said. Uh-huh. When? Eventually, Marnie snorted. You are the worst secret keeper who somehow kept the biggest secret in the world for 12 years. Wren almost smiled. This time she let herself finish it. Because that was the difference now. She let herself finish things. A car pulled up outside her house, unfamiliar. A rental. And for one instinctive half-second, old habits flared bright and sharp. Before Wren remembered, there was nothing left to brace against. June climbed out first, moving easier now than she had 3 weeks ago. Healing in the particular way that only happens once the lie underneath an injury finally stops making it worse. Delia followed, already laughing at something her mother had said. 12 years of missing time being stitched back together one ordinary afternoon at a time. We were in the area, June called out, grinning. Delia wanted pie. I told her Vermont people take that very seriously. We do, Wren said. Extremely seriously. Marnie looked between the 3 of them, the physics teacher. The woman who'd apparently the 3 of them, the physics teacher. The woman who'd apparently come back from the dead. And the young nurse who'd somehow found her mother and a piece of her own history in the same impossible week, and shook her head slowly. I have so many questions, she said. Ask them over pie, Wren said. I'm buying. She walked toward June and Delia across her own front lawn. Autumn light, falling gold and warm across all 3 of them, and for the first time in 12 years, Wren Calloway looked up at a sky full of nothing more dangerous than clouds, and felt nothing but peace looking back at her. Because some secrets, once finally let go, don't just disappear, they make room. For grief to become memory, for guilt to become gratitude, for a woman who spent 12 years hiding from the sky, to finally let it hold her again. And somewhere above Thornfield, a single contrail scratched its way across the pale afternoon, and for once, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, Wren looked up. She watched it all the way until it disappeared.